I'm with Sister Mary Boyes, who's in New York. Mary, what's the impact of the coronavirus? I mean, you've been very much at the center of the pandemic in the United States, and particularly from your perspective, what impact is it having on Christian practice and observance?
Well, one of the things that is most noticeable is that New York City is a quasi-ghost town relative to the activity and frenetic activity very often in the city. It's a city that has really been sobered by the tragedy of the coronavirus. A city that has slowed down immensely, that, of course, the practice of social distancing and so forth has meant a tremendous sort of impact just on daily life, and of course, certainly on the economy. In terms of Christian churches, well, what happens when you have a tradition where you meet daily or at least once a week for worship, and now people are no longer able to come together in the same way? So now I'm not a sociologist, and I haven't read any studies, but I don't think there are any churches that are operating in any kind of normal fashion. So in my own tradition, which particularly the celebration of the Eucharist is an important part of the community gathering weekly, many parishes have moved that to live streaming. I must admit that, particularly as a woman in the church, simply watching a priest say Mass is not at all a spiritual experience that I think is commensurate with the meaning of the Eucharist. But I've found some places where there's more attention to ritual aspects, such as music, that enhances worship. And I have to say, for the time being, having found a place where there is music and sensitive use of ritual and intelligent preaching, I think for the time being, this is what must be. And frankly, I think the challenge to churches like ours is, what do we do when things are opened up a bit about communion? When we have the unleavened bread and the wine, but it's always been a symbol to share the one cup. Well, I don't think that'll ever be back. So there have been tensions in other areas of the United States. I'm not aware so much in New York City, between people who are demanding that religious services be able to be held, that the government cannot infringe on our liberties in this way. I think this is a very unfortunate and needless tension in the time of a pandemic, but nonetheless, these tensions are rife in certain areas of the United States.
You're an expert in the interfaith conversation, especially between Christians and Jews. Have you noticed a greater coming together, collaboration, or a greater division? I was intrigued by your comment that as a Catholic woman, watching a streaming service is not exactly spiritually nourishing. So I just wonder if there's also anything crossing the gender divide as well with different faith communities.
I was just talking to a friend of mine last week about, assuming this is going to go on for some time, are there rabbis who are meeting to talk about some sort of way in which electronics could be which there could be a virtual synagogue service and so forth, and I believe that they're quite a lively conversation. So part of it, is even our how do we give access to our tradition in this time? One advantage that I wouldn't have anticipated. So I've just finished last week teaching this course, Studies in Jewish Christian Relations, which I've co-taught with Professor and Provost Shuli Reuben Schwartz. And we have one of the requirements of the course is to do projects, and there are various options they can choose from. And the only sort of rule of thumb besides the broad rubric is you must do it with people from the other school. So one group chose to to study ritual in both traditions. And by the time we got to the projects, we were already in the online tradition. So they attended virtually 3 different worship services, one in the Jewish traditions, 2 different Christian ones. And the Jews in this small group, so I can only say this is just one, this is not a statistically reliable sample, but they had actually viewed virtually a celebration of the Eucharist in the Catholic tradition on Palm Sunday, where frankly I would never, I mean, that would not be my suggestion because there's the reading of the Passion account. But because they were doing all of this virtually, they were much more at ease. They didn't have to worry about, should I stand or, and were kind of able to almost an appropriate distancing of themselves. Anyway, I have to go back and see if I can recapture some of the things they wrote about that. But there is a way in which we can take one another into aspects of our tradition in a way that's sort of safer.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's so interesting because one of the challenges, as you know, particularly when it comes to liturgy, is not being a participant, but being an outsider. But in a way, of course, everybody's an outsider. So
right.
I could be sitting next to a Christian as a Jew myself, next to a Christian watching the same service, but we're both outsiders to it. Now that actually is quite interesting theologically, isn't it? One can not just play with it, but one can develop in perhaps a new way in terms of what community means, maybe what sharing ritual means without syncretizing, without losing one's own identity.
One other aspect, not connected at all to formal teaching, is that now that people are watching more films and so forth, Netflix and all of the variant kind of things. So at least in my circles, and with my friends, most of whom are not connected so much to Jews and Judaism, the unorthodox film has made a huge impact. I mean, people are absolutely mesmerized by it. And I think it's because, for all the particularities of that show, it's really about some person finding her voice. And in the way, of course, in the film, it's literally her voice. So maybe some of these things that we were able to be taken into another tradition in a way that we wouldn't have anticipated before.
And as a teacher, and unfortunately you have to draw to a close, but as a teacher, this gives you a new tool, if you like, in terms of teaching. And is that something that, is that one takeaway you might take from this as a teacher, not in terms of the theology of it, but as a teacher? Is that something you think when we return to some kind of normality, whatever it is, that you'll be able to carry on using in the classroom?
Yes, I think the key will be the ability to ask the follow-up question that people can discuss among themselves, not just to leave it as my private viewing of the other, but say, well, what moved you and why? And like if we were studying ritual, this would be a great way to go into some of the theory about ritual. That's not my field, so I'm not gonna. I'm gonna briefly pass.
It's the so what question, Mary, isn't it?
Yes, it's always a so what question.
So what difference does it really make?
Yes.
Well, let me put that back to you. My final question. So what? What difference will COVID-19 make?
Oh, I think it'll take the rest of my life to begin to probe that. I think for many of us, as one grows older, mortality is on your screen in a way that it wasn't earlier in life, at least because I've never had any health scares, but certainly mortality. The way in which, well, let me just say what I'd said to one of our students who has no knowledge what she's going to do now after this fabulous education. And I said, well, it's hard to plan, but it really is always hard to plan. We just think that we can be certain. And now uncertainty is just, it's the world we live in. So our vulnerability, contingency, fragility, you know, those are words that carry a lot of meaning right now. And we hope it's transformative. But good and evil continue to coexist.
Mary Boyce, thank you very much.